Thank you for watching I24 News. I'm Michelle Divone with an extended news bulletin this hour. We begin in Israel, where the Internal Security Service, the Shin Bet, reveals they have arrested members of a Hamas terror cell. According to the information released, the cell was planning an abduction and shooting attack that would be used as a bargaining chip for a future prisoner exchange. Israel has no interest in intervening in the civil war in Syria, says Israel's Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman today at the opening of a security cabinet meeting. Lieberman saying Israel prevented the transfer of chemical weapons to Hezbollah in South Lebanon, comments made one day after Israel was accused of striking the Meze air base near Damascus.
The State of Israel has no interest in intervening in the Syrian civil war. Our policies, our positions are very clear and are based upon three red lines. We will not allow any harm to Israeli citizens, we will not allow any infringement of Israel's sovereignty, and we will not allow the smuggling of high-grade weapons or chemical weapons from Syria to Lebanon for Hezbollah.
And to discuss his remarks, we're joined by our senior defense correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari. So, Shai, what can we understand from his remarks made just one day after Israel is being accused of targeting Syrian targets?
Right. I think it's as close to an admission of an Israeli connection to what was reported by Syrian sources a day ago as you're going to get from a defense figure. It seems quite clear that Israel had something to do with it, considering his remarks. What he was saying today, and this was similar to things he said yesterday to EU diplomats. He was basically laying out Israel's policy, really, its red lines in terms of interventions in Syrian territory. He was being quite explicit, more explicit than usual. Usually we hear silence on these kinds of incidents. What he said about protecting Israel's sovereignty actually has more to do with the incident with Islamic State a week or two ago, where there was really some issue of people being on the wrong side of the fence there. In terms of not allowing the smuggling of advanced weaponry or perhaps chemical weapons to Hezbollah, that's a little more specific also than we usually hear. I think it's a little premature to draw any distinct conclusions over what exactly was hit there in the Meze air base on the outskirts of Damascus, but it's interesting that he went so public with it. It's important to remember he was making these comments in the context of laying out a general policy, though. Sure,
and also, Shai, looking at Syria, and as you mentioned, the comments were maybe reflecting more towards the attack by Islamic State, the chaos there now in its fifth year of the civil war. Is Israel in any way involved in what's happening in Syria? And does Israel, when would you say Israel would make any sort of move in that area?
Right. In terms of the strike that we saw, I think it's safe to assume that had something to do with some sort of Hezbollah weapon transfer. That seems to be the reasoning whenever Israel chooses to strike in that kind of context inside deep into Syrian territory. It's a different situation when Israel responds against the Syrian regime for spillover across the border. When it comes to actually intervening in the Syrian conflict itself, Israel does not really do that. It's true that Israel has certain interests in the border region. It sees as a prime interest of preventing any sort of establishment of an Iranian base of operations on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights, something that Iran has more or less made clear in terms of its own intentions to launch attacks at Israel from that location. That is seen as a prime interest to prevent that from the Israeli side. And in that context, Israel prefers a lesser evil, you could say. It prefers to perhaps have rebel groups on that adjacent border rather than representations of the Syrian regime itself, which is directly linked to Iran, considering those Iranian intentions.
And of course, Israel wants to be able to know what's going on. Now, we also reported about arrests made by the Shin Bet arresting a terror cell. What can you tell us about that?
Right. 6 cell members arrested, and one, in fact, already in prison, but was involved in this plot anyways. A 58-year-old, Ibrahim Abdallah Nimat, one of the central members of this plot, known for his links to Hamas. He was responsible for a number of deadly terrorist attacks in the 1990s. The plan here was really to carry out some sort of shooting attack as well as an abduction with a view to later securing the release of Palestinian prisoners. This is something which is a more developed sort of plot with links to a known terrorist network. Of course, Hamas, something we've seen less of in the context of this wave of terror, which has lasted for over a year, and it's also something that is easier for the Israeli authorities to crack down. It's also more dangerous, of course. We're talking about a more intricate, developed sort of plot, which could have ended very badly, and thankfully it was there was a crackdown and it was stopped from actually being carried out. But again, this is easier for the Israeli security establishment to follow, to trace, and to crack down upon.
Than the latest wave that was really much characterized by lone wolf attacks. But this arrest, you mentioned the leader still being in jail. This is not the first time that we hear about someone operating within his jail cell. I mean, how does this work technically?
Right. Technically, they apparently, and this happens all around the world, communication devices, phones, basically, are able to be smuggled into prison cells. It's something that the prison system has to deal with. There was, not so long ago, a few weeks ago, there were raids on certain prison systems in Israel to basically take some of those devices out. Prisoners were moved around. But despite this, we see that plots are able to be carried out with the involvement of people who are still in prison. Really, the leaders of Hamas in terms of its military or terrorist infrastructure, or most of them are in prison, and a lot of the know-how still exists there. Unfortunately, it also has some contact with the outside world.
And definitely doesn't stop them from being the minds behind a lot of operations. Shai Ben-Ari, thanks so much for this. Now, a major cyber attack on German sub maker ThyssenKrupp is reported today, saying significant trade secrets have been stolen from the company. ThyssenKrupp has contracts with Israel to build 3 submarines and 4 warships, an agreement which has stirred national controversy in Israel surrounding the prime minister and his family. Now, according to the report, the data taken was from Plant Engineering Division, and the company is looking at unnamed attackers in Southeast Asia and does not yet know the full extent of its intellectual property losses. In the meantime, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry is holding fresh talks with his Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Germany in what has become a continuous bid to halt the fighting in Aleppo. Russia's deputy foreign minister is saying they're close to reaching an understanding. And now we move to Syria, where President Bashar Assad says a victory for his army in Aleppo would be a, quote, huge step towards ending the country's 5-year civil war. It comes amid further losses for the Syrian rebels in the embattled city. In a blistering 3-week offensive, Syrian government forces have seized about 80% of East Aleppo, a stronghold for the rebel group since 2012. But the humanitarian situation grows more dire by the day, as Chloe Liu reports.
Plumes of smoke cloud the skyline. This as Syrian troops make their way through ancient ruins in the old city of Aleppo.
I am now at the position of Aleppo Citadel, this ancient historic fortress that expresses the strength of Aleppo in Syria.
The military recently captured the historic site, along with around 80% of previously rebel-held territory. And now the Syrian army is determined to take the rest of the city.
The fighting on the eastern side of Aleppo will continue with the Free Syrian Arab Army and the friendly forces, day and night, until we liberate these neighborhoods from all the terrorists. The message we want to send to those armed terrorists is as follows. Either you come out in accordance to the Syrian conditions, or you will meet your death for sure.
The Syrian government demands that rebels pull out of Aleppo, but opposition forces say they will not withdraw or negotiate until the humanitarian crisis is resolved. And they are now calling for a 5-day ceasefire to evacuate besieged civilians. Despite the rebels' refusal to leave, the U.S. and Russia discuss safe passage for the several thousand fighters.
Working on something, and we'll see where we get. Not confident, I'm hopeful that we'll see where we are.
Thank you. Aleppo is the last urban stronghold of opposition forces, and taking it could be a turning point in the civil war.
The victory in Aleppo is a strategic and qualitative one that will make way for political settlement.
Capturing Aleppo would be a major win for Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, but the hundreds of thousands of residents who have faced years of death and destruction in the city are unlikely to share in the triumph.
To discuss this, we're now joined by our senior Middle East correspondent, Mohammed El-Qassem. Good evening to you. Mohammed, are you with us?
Good evening, Michelle.
Good evening. So, Mohammed, now 3 weeks into the offensive, what can you tell us about the territorial losses that the Assad regime is saying that the rebels have suffered?
Well, Well, this is a significant advancement and win for the Syrian army. This is something that will really shift the momentum to the side of the Syrian regime, giving them not only a moral victory, but also a territorial victory. Now they have been able to capture more than 80% of the eastern part of the city of Aleppo, which means that it's within reach that they are capable and able at the same time of taking over the rest of the eastern part of Aleppo. This is something that the rebels will not be able to really be able to we should say come back and win. They cannot do a counter-offensive on the Syrian army because they will, with the loss of this territory, they will only have to move either to the north to the province of Idlib, well, they will have to regather and reorganize themselves, but they will be scattered, and that's why it's extremely important for the Syrian army to recapture the city of Aleppo, which, by the way, will make it will give the government the top 5 most populated cities in Syria to be under their control, and this is also an extremely significant point for the government.
Meanwhile, the governor of Aleppo is giving a very grim picture. He said today that 150,000 people are actually being sentenced to death.
Yeah, that just goes to show you how bad the situation is right now in the city. There is still fierce fighting between government army and its allies, and the bombardment from the skies is relentless. The Syrian Air Force with the Russian Air Force are continuing with their airstrike over the eastern part of the city or whatever is not under the control of the Syrian forces, making it extremely difficult for the civilians living there. Just a couple of days ago, we were talking about more than 250,000 of them. Now, with about 100,000 of them have been either fleeing or now with the government capturing of the territories, there are about 150,000 left in whatever territory is under the control of the rebels, and it's a small territory, making it very difficult for them or for civilians to avoid being wounded or killed.
Mohammed Al-Qasim, thanks so much for this latest update. Iraqi forces, meanwhile, are trying to cut off the Islamic State's supply lines to force them out of Mosul. Caught in the crossfire as many as 1 million civilians, Ariel Levine-Waldman has the story.
Iraqi forces launched a new wave of assaults on the city of Mosul, the so-called Islamic State's main stronghold in Iraq. Artillery fire rained down on IS positions on Thursday as soldiers tried to capture or destroy bridges the terrorist army uses for resupply and to launch attacks. The United States launched airstrikes against the bridges earlier in the week but was unable to bring them down. The army's advance was blunted Wednesday by waves of suicide bombings and ambushes from hidden tunnels. Local militias are fighting alongside the military to retake their homes.
These soldiers are all my brothers. They are better than IS several times over. We want to wipe out IS entirely. All these soldiers honor us. They can place their shoes on our heads. It's an honor for me to be walking amongst the soldiers and officers, a matter of pride for me.
Government forces say they control about half of the city's eastern districts, but the western section is still in IS hands, allowing for easy escape and reinforcement from Syria. Government forces say they are closing the noose on these routes. Taking Mosul would undo the Islamic State's biggest gains in Iraq and threaten their hold on the country. And the people fighting street to street in the battleground city are eager to finish the job.
We will attack them and hurt them, God willing. They came to destroy Iraq, but we will burn these dogs.
Efforts to retake the city are slowed by anywhere from 600,000 to 1 million civilians still trapped inside. The army has been liberating districts as they take them, but nearly 1,000 civilians have died, along with over 1,000 Iraqi soldiers.
A huge victory for gay couples in Israel wanting to become parents. Attorney General Avichai Mendelblit informed the High Court of Justice today of his decision to make the process of acquiring Israeli citizenship the same for LGBT foreign couples as straight foreign couples. A decision that will prevent discriminatory measures in the future. The chairman of the Gay Dads Association, Udi Ledergur, whose organization filed the petition, said this marks a major breakthrough. And he joins us now to discuss today's decision. Good evening. Good to have you with us.
Good evening.
So you called today's decision a huge victory.
Absolutely. This is a huge victory, and it's great news for hundreds of gay couples, both men and women, one of which is an Israeli citizen and the other is a foreign citizen. Up till now, they were seriously discriminated against straight couples in the same situation exactly, where straight couples who have a foreign spouse, it took them up to 4 years to gain full Israeli citizenship. For gay couples, this used to take up to 7 years, and they didn't always end the process with full citizenship, but usually only with permanent residence.
And Udi, how does this affect the children of gay couples?
The children are also impacted in a very serious way. We have a situation in real life right now where a couple of men went through a surrogacy process abroad because Israel bans surrogacy in Israel for gay couples. They came back with the 2 children, which was a difficult process in and of itself. And at the end of the process, only one of the children was granted full Israeli citizenship, the one who is biologically related to the Israeli citizen. The other child, who was born from the same twin pregnancy, they go to the same kindergarten, they share the 2 same fathers, but because the other child is only related to the non-Israeli citizen, he only has a temporary citizenship in Israel and not a full Israeli citizenship. So it's a ridiculous situation.
Indeed. I hope this is something that the media is very much picking up on. Tell us about the challenges you faced when submitting this petition.
Well, as chairman of the Association of Israeli Gay Fathers, we're looking at the full spectrum of discriminations against gay families and specifically gay fathers in Israel. A few to mention, while surrogacy has been legal in Israel for the last 20 years for straight couples, gay fathers, single fathers, and even single women are not allowed to get the assistance of surrogacy in Israel. So that's something that we're out to change. And next month, we have a very important hearing on that petition. Adoption is another area where we're constantly discriminated in. Gay families are not allowed to adopt children in Israel if they're not related to them before the adoption process. So we have a hearing on that in a couple of months, and we hope for a favorable ruling on that as well. And so today's important victory, I hope, is one of many to come. We're set to change and correct all those discriminations within the law and society, whether the state comes to its senses and gives us what we're looking for in the name of justice and equality, or the courts will do our work for us.
How advanced would you say Israel is when it comes to gay rights, and what are the main obstacles that still lie ahead?
Well, I think that's a great question. It depends on your point of reference, both geographically and in the timeline. So 20 years ago, Israel maybe was considered a gay heaven as far as gay rights. We had a few good rulings here, although most of the rulings in the gay history or the LGBT history in Israel were granted by the courts, not by the lawmaker. I think if we look today to the Western world, namely to Canada, United States, and parts of Western Europe, we're falling behind, seriously. Gay marriage has been legalized throughout Canada and United States and several European countries for years now. Adoption and surrogacy for gay singles and couples has been legal in many countries for years now. And Israel is seriously falling behind. So I think many of our officials and ministers touting how wonderful life here is for LGBTs, that's only if you compare us to maybe African countries where things are definitely a lot worse, or other Middle Eastern countries where things are definitely a lot worse. But that's not my point of reference. That's not where I want to be today.
And would you single out in any way Tel Aviv, which is the capital of gay rights and gay citizens, maybe of the Middle East, or maybe one of the capitals of the world, as it attracts thousands of tourists every year for Gay Pride Week and the Gay Pride Parade? Where would you put Tel Aviv in all of this?
Well, absolutely. I think that not because of, but despite of everything else going on in Israel and despite the official policies coming from our lawmakers, which is very anti-gay, there's no other way of looking at it. In recent years, Tel Aviv has become a legitimate gay capital as far as gay culture, gay society. I myself have traveled to London, Paris, New York, you name it, Berlin, and I can definitely say that Tel Aviv stands right there next to the best of them. So as far as cultural life, we have a film festival, we have parties every night. You can see gay families with their twin strollers on Rothschild Boulevard. It's a common thing you see every day now. But you'll also see that when people talk about Tel Aviv abroad, even in official Ministry of Tourism campaigns abroad, they'll talk about Tel Aviv without mentioning the word Israel in it, because Israel is not associated with liberalism, with pluralism, and with basically letting people lead their lives. So I'm hoping for the day where a couple of men or a couple of women can walk safely any place in Israel, in the north of Israel, in the south of Israel, not only in Tel Aviv, whether they're with children or not, and we need to fix this.
Hopefully Tel Aviv and Israel will be aligned, and sooner than later. Udi Ledergur, thank you so much for speaking with us this evening. Now to the latest on the Trump transition. The president-elect takes to Twitter once again, this time to blast union leader Chuck Jones moments after he accused him of lying about saving jobs in Indiana. Meanwhile, looking at Trump's latest cabinet pick, former wrestling executive Linda McMahon will head the Small Business Administration, a choice some are calling the most bizarre yet. ABC News with the story.
The man dubbed by Time magazine president of the divided states of America continues to split the country. A new Bloomberg poll shows Donald Trump's favorability rating at 50%, with 49% of Americans polled believing the country is heading in the wrong direction.
I believe we're in the process of putting together one of the all-time great cabinets that has ever been assembled in our nation's history.
The president-elect believes he and his cabinet will change that, though so far many of his choices for key roles have come with their fair share of controversy. The latest, Trump's choice of Oklahoma Attorney General Scott Pruitt to lead the Environmental Protection Agency.
Attorney General Pruitt has great qualifications and a good record as the AG of Oklahoma.
Pruitt's bio on the AG website shows he established the state's first federalism unit to combat unwarranted regulation and overreach by the federal government, and is a leading advocate against the EPA's activist agenda. The pick has drawn sharp criticism from environmental advocates and Democrats who say Pruitt denies the science of climate change and has routinely chosen the big oil and coal industry over the well-being of his constituents. They are promising a tough nomination fight. Senator Brian Schatz of Hawaii tweeting, "Nominating a climate denier to run the Environmental Protection Agency is offensive. I will do everything I can to stop this."
And I24 News correspondent and analyst, legendary analyst, Ami Kaufman joins us now to discuss the latest from the Trump transition period. Good evening.
Good evening, Michal. How are you?
I'm great. So let's talk a little bit about Trump's latest attack through Twitter. It seems his battleground using Twitter is not in any way subsiding.
Yeah, don't insult Donald Trump because it's just going to end up on Twitter no matter what you do. He basically took a jab at Indiana union boss called Chuck Jones. It all goes back to this big move that he claimed Trump that he saved some jobs from a Carrier, this company that makes air conditioners, from going down to Mexico, saving about more than 1,000 jobs. Chuck Jones said it was only 800 jobs, that Trump was lying, and Trump called that he was doing a horrible job. But later on, what's even more worrying is that after this tweet rant that Trump had, Chuck Jones started receiving some phone calls. So that's what happens when you have a Twitter rant, and that's, it's kind of dangerous, I guess.
So they did have a back and forth on Twitter, but he also then later received some threats via phone. But let's also talk about Trump's latest pick. Some are calling it the most bizarre yet. Linda McMahon, what can you tell us about this appointment? Yeah,
Linda McMahon, definitely. Well, she's a 68-year-old. She's co-founder and the former CEO of the professional wrestling franchise WWE, the World Wrestling Entertainment. Trump himself is a WWE Hall of Fame member. which explains a little. And what also explains this appointment is that Linda McMahon herself gave $6 million to a Trump super PAC, which shows, again, that Trump really approves of people who are loyal to him throughout the campaign. Even though she's had an unsuccessful run for U.S. Senate seat in Connecticut in 2010, she was a really early supporter of Trump's presidential campaign, and he's paying back with that show of loyalty. But as that report that you showed earlier, the more controversial appointment is Scott Pruitt for the EPA. If you are a person who happens to believe science and that humans are contributing to this, that is man-made global warming, this is a very disconcerting appointment.
And always much to talk about and many headlines coming from the U.S. at this time. Ami Kaufman, thank you very much. Probably also the next 4 years. That wraps up our extended news bulletin. You can join us again at the top of the hour with all the latest updates from around the world. I'm Michelle Divone. Thank you for watching. Thank you for watching I24 News. I'm Michelle Divone with an extended news bulletin this hour. We begin in Israel, where the internal security service, the Shin Bet, reveals they have arrested members of a Hamas terror cell. According to the information released, the cell was planning an abduction and shooting attack that would be used as a bargaining chip for a future prisoner exchange. Israel has no interest in intervening in the civil war in Syria, says Israel's Defense Minister Avigdor Lieberman today at the opening of a security cabinet meeting. Lieberman saying Israel prevented the transfer of chemical weapons to Hezbollah in South Lebanon, comments made one day after Israel was accused of striking the Meze air base near Damascus.
The State of Israel has no interest in intervening in the Syrian civil war. Our policies, our positions are very clear and are based upon 3 red lines. We will not allow any harm to Israeli citizens, we will not allow any infringement of Israel's sovereignty, and we will not allow the smuggling of high-grade weapons or chemical weapons from Syria to Lebanon for Hezbollah.
And to discuss his remarks, we're joined by our senior defense correspondent, Shai Ben-Ari. So, Shai, what can we understand from his remarks made just one day after Israel is being accused of targeting Syrian targets?
Right. I think it's as close to an admission of an Israeli connection to what was reported by Syrian sources a day ago as you're going to get from a defense figure. It seems quite clear that Israel had something to do with it, considering his remarks. What he was saying today, and this was similar to things he said yesterday to EU diplomats. He was basically laying out Israel's policy in the Meze air base on the outskirts of Damascus. But it's interesting that he went so public with it. It's important to remember he was making these comments in the context of laying out a general policy, though.
Sure. And also, Shai, looking at Syria, and as you mentioned, the comments were maybe reflecting more towards the attack by Islamic State, the chaos there now in its 5th year of the civil war. Is Israel in any way involved in what's happening in Syria? And does Israel, when would you say Israel would make any sort of move in that area?
Right. In terms of, really its red lines in terms of interventions in Syrian territory, it was being quite explicit, more explicit than usual. We hear silence on these kinds of incidents. What he said about protecting Israel's sovereignty actually has more to do with the incident with Islamic State a week or two ago, where there was really some issue of people being on the wrong side of the fence there. In terms of not allowing the smuggling of advanced weaponry or perhaps chemical weapons to Hezbollah, that's a little more specific also than we usually hear. I think it's a little premature to draw any distinct conclusions over what exactly was hit there in